Hello, everyone. It's been a very interesting time. Recently lost a friend of mine, so poured a horn of mead, and yeah, been thinking about him a lot lately. Also been writing a new book, which I will show you right now. If you can see at the bottom of the screen, these are literally all of the companion documents that I have open to help me write it. It's a huge process, enormous undertaking, and one of the most fun things I've ever done in my life. So I'll never stop. To him, rest in power. Let's go. The court of King Jaroslav the Wise. My good King Jaroslav! Harold erupted into the court. The doors were open already, and so he entered with his arms out wide, pointing to the walls. There on the throne sat the elderly but powerful king. Yaroslav looked every inch the proud and strong man he had the reputation for being. His gray hair was still dappled with the dark black of youth, and his face showed all the strength and wisdom of a king. His jaw and beard were of the strongest definition a man can achieve, and he sat with a tall, straight posture in the seat of his power. Everyone knew that he had united the principalities, a daring feat that many thought a miracle, and ruled this union with fairness and piety. Harold approached the throne, walking boldly down the long feasting hall toward the dais with a smile on his face and a posture that took in every part of the room. The king was great, but Harold was mighty. My good King Jaroslav, whom many call the wise, but whom I know to be truly wisest of men, he said in his booming and encompassing voice. Harold spoke here in the language of the Kievan Rus, which many among his men knew. Behind him came his warriors with chests of wealth and bolts of fine silk or bundles of pelts. My friend, excuse me, my friend, the king said, standing from his throne and throwing wide his arms similarly. Long has it been, 10 years or more. And you come now decked in finery that we can barely match with a kingdom. This night shall be a feast, dedicated to you and these your proud and good warriors. Much will we need to hear of the great feats you accomplished in your time, adventuring the distant corners of the world. The hall had been populated with the king's court. It was no hidden thing when two ships bearing the warrior Vikings came from the river, and all knew it heralded the arrival of the Varangian. Many of the attendants and courtiers came to witness what would be the spectacle of the reunion. The whole room cheered loudly at the mention of the feast, even the Norse and Danes among them, who understood not the king's words. They didn't need translation to know from context what was said, though. A night for a feasting? Harold asked the room loudly. I think I would rather a whole week of it. Look at what I have brought with me. He went to Hafald, who bore a large chest, his exposed arms showing the strain it took to keep it held in front of him. Let it spill, Stormhunter, he said quietly in Norse. The chest had been held reversed, so the lid opened toward Hafald. And now, when Harold unlatched it and pulled it over toward him, it was overturned easily, and gold and silver spilled loudly onto the floor. Coins rolled and spun and clattered in every direction, and Hafald let go the ornate chest to fall onto the pile of money it had held. People laughed and cheered and started to bend to collect the great hoard that was thrown about so frivolously. The king himself laughed joyously at the show and clapped. Just the king I remember, the king began, and this even is but a tiny amount compared to what you have sent to have stored here. Ever have the coffers been bursting with what you have many times put into our care? Thrice, Harold said, kicking at the pile of money and spraying more coins. 3 times did I receive the pollutus farfa. I, Harold Sigurdsson, he raised his hands to elicit a cheer, sacked the Roman treasury for the death of the emperor by 3 times. The riches and prestige I garnered so far from my home has here given me the fire I need. I return to take my rights, my birthright, my home, and the marriage right I was promised. None failed to notice that by the king's side was his daughter Elisaveta, who the Northmen called Elisif. The king had promised Harold that if he grew his wealth and fame to a great proportion in his time south, that the princess would be his to marry, and their alliance would be made. Past Sicily's wide plains we flew, a dauntless, never-wearied crew. Our Viking steed rushed through the sea, as Viking-like fast sailed we. Never, I think, along this shore did Norsemen ever sail before. Yet to the Russian queen I fear, my gold adored, I am not dear. When he spoke the last refrain of the poem he'd composed, he approached and knelt for the princess. She looked at him with slightly parted lips, her face a combination of youthful femininity and carefully composed innocence. She looked the perfect princess, wearing a regal dress and wearing all her hair bound up in a wimple that was laced with pearls. I composed 16 poems in my journey here from Miklagard, princess, and each ended with that sentence. I come to you, no longer the boy who'd lost everything I had, but the man who gained everything a man can have. I would prevail upon the offer made to take your hand in a marriage and wed you. And I would grant it, the king said. You have shown many times over you are more than worth of the royal assignment of this princess. She will go into your house and get you your children. The throne room cheered again at the declaration. Though Herald, these are matters of politic and state. We have not done yet this feast to deserve. Come, bring the feasting dress. At the command, music started to play, and servants walked out of the doors at the sides of the room, each servant bearing alone or with another great wooden platters, great wooden platters laden with food of all sorts. The scent of spices and roast meat wafted instantly through the hall and quieted everyone except Bodil, who cheered loudly and dropped her own burden of furs onto the floor. The music was made up of several string instruments and some flute, and they played a merry tune in perfect time with each other. And to this the warriors all sat at the table and feasted. Bodil's eyes were wide with delight and love of all she saw before her. The candles and torches illuminated the bounty of foods laid out before them, the closest thing to her being a large wooden bowl piled high with roasted apples. She took one and immediately dropped it onto the plate before her. Hot, she said, sucking at her fingers. Is it fork, lassie? Ragnar said, handing her a long, two-pronged fork with a weathered wooden handle. Aye, give me that. There's something in this, I think. She took a small knife from her belt and cut the soft apple flesh in two. The core had been hollowed out, and in the space had been stuffed with cheese that melted over the sides. Are they all like that? Asked Niels. He took one of the apples on a fork and cut it open. They are! He blew on the cheese to cool it and ate it. It's delicious! Fitbjorn had a large haunch of boiled beef seasoned with rosemary twigs and honey between he and Inga, and sliced off a large section. I would have some of that too, she said, looking at him. Fitbjorn noted a strange look in her eye, and looked over to Hafald, who he found to be distracted, talking with Harold's strong arm. He served her the large piece he'd just cut, and she smiled at him. Some combination of the act of serving her the food and the smile she showed him made him think about how long it had been since he'd had a woman. And in that moment, he wanted her deeply and with a burning insistence. She turned to the side and tore a piece of bread from a large loaf that had been set there and handed it to him. Thanks, he said quietly. He filled his own plate with much more food and took a cup and filled it with a drink from a ewer. What is it? Asked Niels. Beer. It's good, he responded with a smile. Give that here. Is it dark? Niels poured himself a cup of the brown, frothy beer and drank deeply in appreciation, burping loudly after done. Olaf, Niels said, wiping his mouth, I have heard much of this. I have heard much of this great wealth you say that you have, but I think I have never seen it. Where has it been sent? Is it here in the Holmgard? Olaf shook his head. It is in the Danish lands, my home. I will have my hoard dug from the earth and my hall built when I return to it. He smiled. Where will you go when with your great wealth? Do you think, Olaf? Where will we have to travel to if we wish to feast in this hall? Asked Bodil. I am thinking that I will make my place in this Iceland I have heard so much of. The laws there are made to protect everyone. Such a place should be where my house is made. He nodded again with a smile. Grand will be my hall, and much shall feasting be had, and all of you are ever be welcome. He nudged Bodil's arm. I will come and visit you then. Once this table has run dry of food, I will need to know my next meal's place. Theodorfer, Harold shouted from his seat next to the King Jaroslav. The wise king here wants to hear a story from our great adventure. Tell him of the time we went on the grand river of the Mesopotamia. Such a thing as those campaigns, all that blood and that sand. Who here could ever want to hear of such glory and victory? What in the land of the Arabs? Theodorfer asked, turning to the room and receiving many cheers of encouragement and thumps upon the tables. Harold, 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 they started to chant. He rode into the lands of Mesopotamia and campaigned for the master in Roman land. Theodorfer started. Harold, 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 continued the chanting. Took we with this campaign twice by 40 castles of enemy hand. Sven added, Harold, Harold, Harold. Then Niels stood and stepped up onto the table. He took us then to Sicily to best our strongest castles, and each we took with our might and cunning. Harold, Harold, Harold. The king laughed and clapped at the display from them all. And then I met a local woman with whom I fell in love with for her cunning. The hall laughed along with Niels and the warriors, those who understood him and those who didn't. Harold then called up Stephanos and to stand before the king, and it was seen that the man did not bow and was apparently not asked to either. He was introduced and merely nodded and placed his hand on his chest as he met the king, Harold translating everything that was ever said. At this, Harold seemed to think it a good idea to trot out all those from Miklagard that had come and started to speak in his stopping Greek, and each one stood and came before the king. After Stephanos, let me introduce this beautiful Ariana and Alina. And here, these broad warrior men are John and Demetrius. Greet the king, my friends. They all bowed their respect, unaware as to what proper decorum dictated, and so electing to be as reverent as possible. The whole hall watched as the king stood and walked down the steps of the dais to greet with the foreigners, shaking their hands and smiling upon each of them. Stephanos then shocked all listening by speaking in the language of the Rus. I thank you for the kindness, great king. I am ready for service of your horse. The king looked at him with a moment of startled pause and then laughed heartily. Harold, you have taught this strange savage to talk. This is hilarious to me. I welcome this service and hope that you will be able to serve in honor. Are these Christian or heathen? Christians them all, Harold said, hoping that Stephanos didn't know the word yet for savage. Thitbjorn watched all of this unimpressed, only focusing on eating and drinking. When he looked back, he saw that Inga was looking straight at him again. And again, he was faced with the fact that she was completely beautiful. Inga looked the way he would imagine Frigg would look. She had a strong and mature feminine beauty that was full with her radiance. From her small nose and ample lips to her sultry dark eyes, she looked like the perfect woman. Thitbjorn looked and saw that Chavald was gone off to sing of the Lord's praises with Harold's strong arm, and it seemed like none noticed that he and Inga were sharing a moment of looking upon each other. What? He asked. I think I wish to know your name, she said, smiling with her eyes only. The effect was intoxicating to his already intoxicated state. I am Thitbjorn. Not that name, she said, leaning closer. There was a strange, energetic power she seemed to be exuding. Something about her felt like it demanded all his attention. That is only the name I have. I may have more one day, but my name has been stolen. He could not help now but to see the swell of her breasts beneath her tunic, something she did not miss either. Much am I curious about your white bear. With all my friends, I know the least of you. I think I should want to know your name. The way she looked at him gave him an undeniable stirring. Are you not with Hafald? She looked at him askance at this, and drank. I am not his wife. Him not my husband. I am not the only he shares his bed with. That sent a rushing fire to course through him. He had no idea what he should say or do. He had felt many times in his life the strange battle sense of total dread when stood before a powerful fighter. Every part of his mind telling him that it was best for him if he only retreated, walked backward away from the line of shields and regroup with your side. But that was always Thitbjorn's favorite of moments, for he felt ever the rush within his spirit to turn that sense and charge it forward, to face into the wind and brace against the coming tide of war ahead of him. He had often too found that it was better life he'd lead only if he lived every moment in this power. And here he felt more that exact sensation. Do you want to go somewhere quiet so you can be loud? He asked her, and the look of complete impressed surprise she showed was entirely worth it to have said. That look then softened and evolved into a determined expression of passion and lust. She picked up her goblet of wine and turned. He stood with his horn so swiftly the chair fell from behind him. Inga made for the door, and he walked along the long table toward the back of the hall, away from the thrones. He rounded the back and felt himself stirring more and more in the anticipation. Someone stood in his way a moment, and he managed to circle them deftly, his well-honed combat experience making itself known in every endeavor he underwent. Once rounded, he looked for the door, and she had gone through it. He felt fire grow inside him and hurried his pace, weaving through the people in the candlelight. The door guards, standing firm with spear in hand, were smiling as they observed the rest of the festivities and seemed not even to notice Fitbjorn walk past them. Out in the dimly lit hallway, he looked left and right, looking for her. The hallway looked the same in both directions, and he felt a strange sense of shame in that momentary place of uncertainty. What the hell am I doing? I didn't even look to Huffle to see. What? What would I even be looking for? Some small part of him definitely wanted a sign of allowance from the man. But that was a strange thought, was it not? Inga was her own woman, a strong and proud warrior, an intelligent and mystic practicer of the Galdir. Probably. She certainly seemed to have put some kind of spell on him. She should have allowed. She should be allowed to do whatever it was she wanted, with whom she wanted. What was more is that she wasn't married to Hafald. They simply spent their time together more often than not. He felt like he should want, for some reason, permission from Hafald as much as he didn't care about such a thing. He breathed in through his nose and looked right again and noticed something that hung on the wall at the end of the hallway. Fitzbjorn walked to that place and saw that it was the light red wrap of silk Inga had been wearing about her neck. He held it and looked left, seeing there another token. The fire within his belly swelled, and he turned to continue the hunt. All hesitation fled. With each step, he felt more and more the power of anticipation rising in him. It was a strange and wonderful anger. When he caught her, he had the feeling that he'd grab her and take her in a violently passionate way. He rounded another corner and caught her slipping in through and beyond a doorway. With a growling huff, he made for the door, fully expecting to see another hallway beyond it. But when the raider turned there, he saw a sizable and fire-lit chamber with a furnished bed, covered in furs and many other comforts. Found me. He slammed closed the door behind him and took 3 thunderous steps, feeling physically bigger with every stride. When he reached her, he grabbed her in an embrace and pressed his lips to hers, rising into the sweet delight of her beauty. He lifted her and grabbed her throat in an embrace, and when the kiss was done, he lowered her back down. She breathed hard at the first interaction and put a hand on his grip on her neck. Strong, she said. He let her go and unclasped the white cape from his shoulders, letting it fall heavily to the floor. He then removed the belt that wrapped around his tunic at the waist and let it fall after the cloak. He shrugged out of the shirt and stood before her in only the heavy cloth breeches. Her eyes devoured his form, the scars, the width, the hair across his thick chest and muscular belly. He smiled at the sight. I have seen this before, she said, her eyes rising back to meet his. There was such depth and feminine wisdom in those eyes. He wanted to grab her and tear the clothes off her with such fury, but wanted more to be patient in that moment. She wore a delicate white tunic with blue embroidery and strong leather breeches underneath. He grabbed the belt at her waist and unwrapped it with ease, the tunic flaring away from her body with the freedom. Fitbjorn then reached down and grabbed the hem. Here he waited a moment. He'd never seen her naked before, and he would savor every instant of this. Inga put a hand on his chest, not to stop him, but to feel his presence. He moaned in the anticipation. Her arms lifted, and he pulled the shirt up and over her head. The clothing was thrown aside. Useless. And she stood before him. It was now his turn to take in the sight of her, though she still wore her pants. Fitbjorn shook his head and reached to undo the ties there, as she'd done with his. Soon enough, they stood before each other naked. Every part of her body was perfect in proportion. She stood tall and proud, looking up into his eyes with satisfied boldness. He put his hands on her hips and pulled her body to his. I think, she started, but Fitbjorn stepped to the right and swung his hand behind and around her, scooping her up in his arms and holding a moment. Fitbjorn stood in a wide stance, holding her in his arms. He looked down at her, then kissed her deeply. He threw her down onto the bed then and put a knee there to climb over her as she trembled, breathing shallowly and crawling back away from him. Again, he placed a hand on her shoulder to hold her there. With a careful motion, he parted her legs with his knee and hovered over her a moment, ready and staying there again in the anticipation of it. Her eyes met his, and in her expression he read all the desire and lust he wanted to see. White bear, she breathed. Inga, he said in a strong voice. Then he entered her and exhaled a long, delighted sigh, feeling much of the tension he didn't know he'd been holding dissolve. He lowered his whole body onto her and shared her warmth. You feel good, he said simply. He pulled back and thrust again, and she moaned in pleasure. You feel hot, she said. She put a hand on his face. Fitbjorn hastened the pace and grabbed her hand, lifting it above her head. Then he grabbed the other and held them there together, keeping the steady rhythm and watching her enjoy his efforts. Her hips moved along with him, and their breathing was matched in the depth and speed. Yes, she breathed to him. Fitbjorn merely grunted in response. He felt her climax around him and saw the unutterable desire in the wincing of her expression. That had been something he had realized. Now he'd long wanted to see. The power of their shared embrace strained the integrity of the bed beneath them, and both were certain it would collapse under their weight. Neither cared at all. Let the damn bed shatter. He let go her hands then and grabbed by the neck again, firm but tender, and wrapped his other arm around her leg to the side. She took his face in her hands and looked at him, almost disbelieving. Her lips parted and her eyes rolled back into her head. They continued in their fucking as the candles burned slowly down. Fitbjorn had been long without a woman's touch and worked at every moment to preserve his continued action as much as he could. Then he felt her climax again, the tensing of her muscles demanding him speed up, and he did so. Such a moment of power, however, tipped him too far over the edge, and his eyes went wide. Oh, gods, he said, going faster, for he was unable to hold himself back, and he too finished. He bellowed and groaned loudly like a wild horse as she came again with him. He knew that it had been soon, too quick for how long he had wanted to lie with her, but in that instantaneous moment of ecstasy, he allowed himself not to care. He groaned and strained, clawing at the bed beside her head and at the wall beyond that. He continued to thrust as he came in great coursing waves, his legs digging through the furs as if he were trying to climb closer to her. I couldn't, he started, speaking through clenched teeth and continuing to groan. She threw her arm around his neck, her nails pressing into his back. The immense wave of orgasm passed, and he pushed up with his arms. Inga, holding on to him so tightly, was lifted with him. He put an arm under her back and carried her up until he was almost kneeling on the bed, her other leg coming up to support her, and she held on tighter to him. They lowered back to the furs together, and the motion created just the right position for him to slide out of her. Fitbjorn collapsed onto a heap on the floor of her, and they lay there panting in shared frenzied bliss, a thin sheen of sweat upon them both. Together, they spent a moment just panting at the exertion they had shared, his head lulled next to hers, and he brought his hand up to rest on her cheek. I couldn't hold it back, he completed. Gods! He put a hand to his lower back. You have strong power in sex, she said, and when you come, I have never seen a man come so strong as you. Always have, he replied, still panting. I don't know what it is. He groaned again. It hurts sometimes. Perhaps I pleased the gods greatly without knowing it. I meant to go longer. His hair was matted together and he cleared it from his face. That was long enough, White Bear. He shook his head. Not for me. She smiled sweetly and put her hands on his head. Strong, she said again. He laboriously undertook the task of rolling off her and nearly fell from the edge of the bed to the floor. Reflexively, she put a hand out to catch him, but he managed to hold himself there. Is, is Huffle... Will he know? He asked, his eyes closed and his voice sounding like it was near sleep. Now you ask such a thing. He does not own me, Raider. This was my choice, something I have wanted for a time now. Fitbjorn reached over with his left hand and grabbed her breast. I think I have wanted it too. You think? She asked, without opening her eyes. Fitbjorn? She asked again, but a moment later heard the contented rumbling of his snore and smiled as she relaxed deeper into the warmth of the furs and the pillows and the white bear. End of the chapter. Next shall be chapter 22. And that is where I will leave it today. Thank you for joining me. And again, I drink well for my friend. Goodbye, everyone.